world.
Министр обороны специально прибыл в Ростов для того, чтобы провести операцию по уничтожению ЧВК «Вагнер». Он использовал артиллеристов и пилотов вертолетов в темную.
This is a criminal, adventuristic campaign. It is equivalent to armed mutiny. Russia will defend itself.
A coup d'etat had started. The paramilitary leader of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, decided to invade Russian territory from Ukraine. Within hours of the attack, his heavily armed paramilitary had already captured the southern city of Rostov-on-Don. Without a lot of resistance, Prigozhin's army captured military facilities in the city, including the airfield there. One of the tanks that rolled into the streets of the city had Siberia written on it, meaning that Prigozhin intended to go for the entirety of Russia. His objective is to overthrow the current Russian regime. At least that is what Russian generals say. Putin accused Prigozhin, who was once one of his best allies, of treason and armed mutiny. He went as far as to compare this new conflict inside of Russia to the Russian Civil War of a century ago. At the beginning of the conflict, we all thought the same. It could turn out to be a civil war between Putin and Prigozhin. We now know that Prigozhin backed off within 24 hours to avoid bloodshed. The leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, claimed he brokered a peace deal, which Prigozhin refuted. But what happened on that Friday was certainly a peculiar event, which drew the attention of all big media outlets. In this video, we'll go over how this was the first attempt to end Putin's regime. Now, coup and war and rebellion, all the words that YouTube algorithm is not a fan of, and this video is filled with these words. So please be sure to hit the like button below so YouTube doesn't throttle the reach of this video. We worked really hard to get this out as quickly as possible, and your like below can help out the video a lot. Just a few months ago, Prigozhin was called Putin's chef because his Wagner mercenary group was somewhat of a private army.
I've spent centuries evolving with the world. That's the nature of being the economy, observing investors choose assets to balance risk and reward, with one element securing portfolios time after time: gold. Agile and liquid, a proven protector. An ever-evolving enabler of bold decisions. An asset more relevant than ever before.
For Putin himself. For years, the Wagner Group did what we call the dirty work in other countries like Syria, Libya, or Mali. In cases where the Russian army couldn't officially be militarily involved in these countries, the Wagner paramilitary offered Putin a helping hand. When Putin started his invasion in Ukraine, he needed every bit of help he could find. That's where he asked his former buddy Prigozhin for help. The Wagner Group is widely seen as a professional army not to be messed with, and their military support has certainly helped Russia in the Ukrainian war. But now, exactly the opposite is true. In one Friday evening, the Wagner Group became one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threat that Putin has ever faced. A heavily armed, highly competent military one day decided to march through Russia, with the main objective being to bring down the current Russian government. What Prigozhin said in a video prior to the invasion tells a lot about how serious this was. All of us are ready to die, all 25,000, and then another 25,000. We are dying for the Russian people. After the invasion happened on that Friday evening, the Russian army took combat measures, moving troops and military vehicles on the streets of Moscow and many other Russian cities. That's how serious it was. Putin was scrambling to defend his own cities, fearing that Russians may soon be fighting Russians in a potential civil war. The events have luckily not escalated that much, but the coup that turned out not to be a coup will go down in history as the first attempt at fighting Putin's regime. Prigozhin's invasion of Russia was directly related to the war in Ukraine, and quite frankly, a very surprising plot twist in the conflict. However, it didn't come as a complete surprise. For many months, there has been a feud between the Wagner paramilitary group and the Russian army. Repeatedly, Prigozhin has accused the Russian government and defense minister of incompetence. Prigozhin was fighting in Ukraine as some sort of private army for Russia, but the cooperation between the Wagner group and the Russian army wasn't going smoothly at all. A month ago, the Wagner group retreated from Bakhmut, the city which they captured after months of deadly clashes. The reason for this was because they were running out of ammunition that Russia was supposed to supply to them. Prigozhin went on to post a video online, showing Wagner's casualties and personally blaming the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, for all these deaths. Prigozhin shouted at Shoigu asking where the ammunition was, something that damaged Shoigu's public image. Apparently, the Russian army wasn't able to supply their troops with enough ammunition to fight the war. According to the Wagner chief, though, the defense minister Shoigu didn't supply them with ammunition on purpose. He claimed that the Russian army wanted to weaken the Wagner group. Prigozhin retreated his troops, saying he needed to reorganize and restructure them for future tasks. We now know that this future task he had on his mind was in fact invading Russia, and that doesn't seem to be a task assigned to him by Putin. A while back, the first fights between the two parties had already happened. After Wagner retreated from Bakhmut, Russian forces allegedly attacked their fellow Wagner mercenaries. At least, that's what Prigozhin claims. Just before the Wagner group actually invaded on Friday, the feud between Prigozhin and Shoigu escalated even further. According to a video that Wagner posted on Telegram, Russian forces bombed a Wagner military camp just before Prigozhin invaded Russia. The Russian government had of course denied this, but the Wagner group was furious, saying that Russia betrayed them. Prigozhin said that he is a true patriot and that he will take revenge for this. The feud, which was once only a conflict in words between the Wagner group and the Russian military, had now escalated into an armed conflict. Prigozhin marched his troops into Russia in a day that will be remembered as a very peculiar one in Russian history. When Prigozhin started to move his troops into Russia, it seemed like he was actually trying to overthrow the Russian government. We were all curious about how this will affect Russia and whether Putin's regime will actually collapse. The chance that Prigozhin would be able to overthrow or significantly weaken Putin was absolutely there, but you need to consider that the Wagner army on its own wouldn't have been able to do the job. Prigozhin had about 50,000 soldiers in Ukraine, which were formerly fighting for Russia. Just a side note, 40,000 of those fighters came from Russian prisons, so we're dealing with tough guys here. But even if you have a lot of tough guys, 50,000 people is a small number if you want to topple Putin's regime. Compare that figure to Russia's total population of 143.4 million people, and it becomes clear that the Wagner group is a small minority in numbers. You can't conquer the biggest country on earth with only 50,000 people, right? Putin, with a standing military of 1.15 million personnel and 2 million in reserves, seems to be in a comfortable lead. We shouldn't forget that Putin has deployed a lot of these Russian soldiers to Ukraine, so he won't be able to immediately bring them home to fight the Wagner group. But still, Putin has an advantage in numbers. At least that's what it seems like. So, why did Prigozhin even invade in the first place? It would be so foolish if he didn't have a plan. Surely the warlord thought that he had a chance. His first assumption was that most Russians would actually support him instead of Putin. In that scenario, the tables would have turned. It's not hard to imagine that some Russian soldiers would have refused to fight the Wagner group because they didn't want to fire on their fellow Russians. And it's not a far stretch to suggest that a lot of Russians like Prigozhin more than Putin. When we look at the internet searches of the Russian population, the trend is clear. Putin is no longer the most popular person in Russia. In the month of May, the Russians searched for Prigozhin's name twice as much as the name of Putin. And even though Putin controls all the media, Putin isn't nearly as popular as he was 2 years ago. Most Russians officially support the war when he looked at the polls. Some surveys show that 2/3 of the Russians support the war, or sorry not sorry, the special military operation. But this doesn't say much about the actual support for Putin. You see, the Russians that don't support the war won't admit it in polls, because it poses a risk to their livelihood when they openly criticize Putin's policy.
When you called me, were you with her?
Tyler Perry's Sisters is back with an all-new season.
I don't want to do this.
You know I still love you, right?